my tears. From darkness far away I cry, for you to bring me near. My heart is overwhelmed, my spirit is cast down, but the shelter of your wings, my Lord, leads me through this troubled ground. The shelter of your wings is a fortress for the fight against the enemy, the foe of truth and right. The shelter of your wings lifts my spirit so to sing. How I love the blessed comfort of the shelter of your wings. Your shelter sets me free from grips of sin and shame. Beneath your wings I soar, lifted high by Jesus' name. My strength is in your power, my might is not my own. It's the shelter of your wings that will carry me toward home. The shelter of your wings is a fortress for the fight against the enemy, the foe of truth and right. The shelter of your wings lifts my spirit so to sing. How I love the blessed comfort of the shelter of your wings. Your mercy and your truth led through the troubled way. The heritage of hope led me high when low I lay. Your name that I so fear did to receive my trust. For mercies mix with justice in the shelter of your wings. The shelter of your wings is a fortress for the fight against the enemy, the foe of truth and right. The shelter of your wings lifts my spirit so to sing. How I love the blessed comfort of the shelter of your wings.
Did you know that the God of the Bible is a wrestler? Yeah, I know. There's a lot of strange stories in the Bible, and this one sometimes kind of escapes our memory. But in Genesis 32, we're going to take a look at a story about how Jacob wrestles with God. You know, whenever I was thinking about God being a wrestler and kind of what that includes, I was kind of only personally into wrestling just whenever I was kind of younger and all. And I remember whenever they'd come on to the ring and all, that they would always have the stage name and the stage presence that they had. And so I've been kind of thinking about, what do you think God's wrestling name would be? You know, I thought about the different names of the Bible that he's referred to as, like the Almighty, the I am that I am, or the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Yes, I know, it's a strange story and it's kind of a strange thought, but there is a purpose in all of it. And in this odd story, it's actually not God who gets a new name, but it's Jacob. Jacob gets the new name. This is whenever Israel is born, at least by that name, Israel. Jacob's name gets changed here in this chapter. But first, let's think about the background of this, because you've got to understand where we're dropping down in the middle of this story. You know, we've been looking a little bit about Abraham. You know, you've got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So now we're kind of a couple generations down. Yes, Abraham's family is growing, and it really is. And here, this story with Jacob, you look at this man, he is supposed to be the one that all these blessings are coming from, or through. God has told Jacob that he is going to be the one through whom all these blessings are going to be fulfilled. But yet, whenever you look at Jacob, he's kind of a story that when you see him, he kind of disappoints me in some ways. Because so many times, yes, he gets the blessing and he kind of gets what is supposed to be his, but he gets it in the wrong ways. He tricks his brother into giving over the birthright and giving over the blessing, kind of just everything that Jacob has. He has because he's tricked somebody about it. And, whenever you have somebody who constantly tricks people and constantly kind of just undermines or underhands every deal that they do, eventually it can catch up to them. And Jacob knows that. That's why we come here into chapter 32 of the book of Genesis. So in Genesis 32, I'm still kind of talking a little bit about this background here because Jacob is preparing to meet his brother Esau. Now, this is the first time that they've met since Jacob tricked him out of every good thing that was supposed to come to Esau. Since Esau was the firstborn, he was supposed to get a blessing and a birthright connected with that. Jacob takes both of those, and then Esau is mad and he's about to kill him. Jacob flees, and now they're going to reunite. And you could imagine the tension that's going to be building up and what Jacob is starting to think of. Look in Genesis 32 and verse 7, it says, "In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups." Now the people that were with him was all these families because the Lord had already blessed Jacob and already had multiplied his family greatly by this point. And Jacob also prays a prayer to God, but notice how he speaks to God, and notice how much he speaks about how, well, God, you've already promised me this. Where is it? You better back me up on this. Because listen to this prayer, verses 9 through 12. Then Jacob prayed, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, 'Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper.' I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted." Notice, first off, how Jacob speaks to God or about God. He says, "The God of my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac." And then he does call him Lord. And whenever you look at this, it's kind of like a distant thing. It's almost like he doesn't address God on his own and say, "Lord, my God." No, no. He's like, "You're the God of my father. You're the God of my grandfather." But it looks at this point that I don't know how much he has embraced this faith just yet. Now, Jacob is going to be found in Hebrews chapter 11. I believe he is a man of faith, but maybe not always in his life. And right here, at this point in his life, he is just kind of sort of piggybacking on the faith of his father or his grandfather and on these promises that God said. He said, "Look, you've said that you're going to bless me. You've said everything's going to be going right. And then, you've said you're going to make my descendants great." He's afraid that Esau's going to kill him. So what's going to happen whenever they meet face to face again? Well, just before they meet, this is the night right before their reunion. In Genesis 32, we're going to skip on down now to verses 22 through 25. That night Jacob got up, took his two wives, his two female servants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Sounds painful, right? Especially any of you who, might have problems with your hip. This sounds rough. And it also kind of sounds a little unfair, doesn't it? Well, in some ways it was unfair. But notice when this takes place. This takes place the very night right before he's about to meet his brother. He's left alone. And then the text says in verse 24 that a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Now, I know that I titled this that Jacob wrestles God. And I believe that Jacob does wrestle with God. I believe this man is kind of some form of God sort of revealing himself and wrestling with Jacob. Obviously, God can most certainly overpower us. But right here, we see that this man is not able to overpower Jacob. And this is very similar to how Jacob has lived his life, right? There's always been this struggle. There's always been this, kind of attack, this wrestling that is taking place. But here, ultimately, we see that God's will is going to be done. Here in this case, he touched the socket. He just kind of, he messed with him in an unfair way, in a weird way that this is going on, right? But the story's not done because it gets even stranger than this. Verses 26 through 28. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Now, I love this passage, actually. And this passage, it means something to me sort of personally. To me personally, I think that this sort of like in a symbolic way, a little bit maybe like a parable. Now, obviously it did take place, but kind of like a parable for us today. It's kind of like our lives. Our lives are oftentimes this wrestling, this struggling that takes place. Sometimes we bring it upon ourselves. Sometimes we just have obstacles that we have to overcome. But we see in Jacob, his faith story is one that there was this struggle, there was this wrestling, there was this fight that took place in the midst of everything that was going on with him. And we see, as confusing as it is, the man's not able to overpower Jacob, and then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." Now, why did he have to leave? I don't know. Jacob had to leave, though. He was about to. But Jacob told him this weird request, which I think by now he's catching on that this is a weird moment. Because he says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." He knew something about this man, that this man could bless him in some way. This man somehow represented God to him. In fact, later on, he's about to ask what the man's name is, but he never even tells him. The man just asks him, "What's your name?" And the way that he blesses him, so to speak, is by changing his name from Jacob, which would be heel grasper or deceiver, trickster, however you kind of want to sort of translate that type of idea about Jacob and what that means. It means the one who grasps his brother's heel. That's kind of why he was called that. But in verse 26, and now it's going to be Israel. And Israel, it has to do with, and it means struggling with God or wrestling with God, because the reason is given right here in the text. Because Jacob had struggled with God and with humans, and he overcame. He was an overcomer. Once again, this is why this story to me is kind of like a parable about us in our spiritual journey, that we are called to be overcomers. We are called to overcome whatever obstacles we might find, even if on the night right before we're about to do something very important, we end up wrestling with some man. I don't know. It's kind of a weird picture, right? It's a weird story. But his name has changed. His name has changed to Israel because he struggled with God and with man, and he overcame. Verses 29 through 32. Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. So I know that verse 32 is kind of odd for us, but keep in mind, this original audience, they were Jews. So every time they didn't eat that particular part, this story would be told. I don't know if they'd exactly tell this story, but it would be brought to their attention, right? Because this is whenever Israel is birthed, so to speak. The name Israel is given. And Jacob is blessed right here, and things are going to continue to go well for him. And Jacob understood something about that place and something about his encounter, because he didn't say that he just wrestled with some man. He says in verse 30 that he named the place that because, he said, "Because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." He had a spiritual encounter that night. But the text called it a wrestling match. Interesting, right? A little different than we're used to. But yet sometimes the struggle in our lives, they can teach us things. And we can grow through them. We can grow from them. Which, by the way, in case you're wondering, yes, the next day he does meet his brother, and this is what happens. In Genesis 33, verses 1 through 5, Jacob looked up, and there was Esau coming with his 400 men. Jacob went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Then Esau looked up and saw the women and the children. "Who are these with you?" he asked. Jacob answered, "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." So this moment, this family reunion, if you will, between Jacob and his brother Esau, it was one that Jacob was so terrified of, but whenever the time came, Esau ran to him. He gave him a hug. He kissed him, and they both wept. Perhaps for different reasons, right? They both had reasons to weep at this moment, but maybe they were slightly different. Well, this time in history, throughout this odd story, we see that this family reunion, it was good. It turned out to be good, right? But does it always go this well in our own lives? No, not always. Maybe, you're at a moment that's a little bit more like Jacob before this time, before this family reunion, and there's tension in your family. There was so much tension in his family, he had to leave. Once again, some of that was brought on by himself, but it doesn't make it any easier to endure. It doesn't always go this well in our lives. But I would suggest to you, there is something we can learn through these stories and through these rough times, through the odd times in our lives as well. And to this now, I want us to turn to the pages of the New Testament. And I want us to see from the book of Hebrews, because the Hebrew writer tells his audience it could be worse. Now that's not the most encouraging words that we want to hear. If a friend of yours is going through a difficult time, I don't know the best thing for you to say is, well, it could be worse. I don't think that provides you with too much comfort. But sometimes it most certainly can be worse than whatever we are having to endure at the moment. In Hebrews chapter 12, we see not only that it could be worse, but there's a purpose in any of our struggling, in any of our resistance, in any of our hardships that we have. Because the way that it's framed right here is it's framed as a discipline that the Lord does for us, to help us to grow. Hebrews 12:4 through 7. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten his word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, "My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you. Because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son." Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? It's a nice little question, right? This whole thing is about how a father disciplines his children and they grow. I mean, the whole purpose is for their good, right? And here they are told, and we are also told, to endure hardship, whatever that hardship might be like in our lives. Endure those hardships as discipline so that we'll learn something from it. Because God is treating us as children. That's a great blessing. I know it doesn't feel like a blessing because it feels like a hardship, and it is a hardship, but there is a blessing in it if we choose to see these things as God is treating us as children. There's a lesson to be learned if we just open up our ears and listen to what the Spirit is saying to us, or open up our eyes and see what God is doing through our lives. You can't always see it in the moment, but maybe at some point we can. I'll also point this out before I read to this next slide. I've got one more for us to look at, and it's the next few verses that follow this. But whenever it says about you and your and stuff, he's not talking to an individual. This is not just about you specifically. He's talking to the whole group that the book of Hebrews is written to. He's talking about us, not just you, but us together. It changes the meaning of it. Because it's not that God is just, punishing you, disciplining you. No. He's disciplining us. He's working through us. He's doing something with us. And that comes into huge play in just a moment right here. In verses 10 through 13 of Hebrews 12, we are told that God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. Notice it's our good, plural. It's that we may share in his holiness. Verse 11, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Yes, that's right, isn't it? Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. See, this passage tells us so many reasons as to why God disciplines us and why God does some of the weird things that he might do in our life. He had a reason for that encounter that night where he was wrestling with Jacob. There was a reason for that. There was a shift in everything about the story of Jacob's life right there on that evening. And here in our own lives, God disciplines us. It's for our good. so that we can share in His holiness. You want to share in the holiness of God? You've got to share in this discipline. You've got to learn to go through this type of discipline, whatever discipline the Lord might send your way. And I love verse 11. Yeah, discipline doesn't seem pleasant whenever we're into it, right? Seems painful at times. However, we can be able to look back at it and see the good. The good that's connected here in verse 11 is the righteousness, the peace that is mentioned. And it all has to do with being trained by it, learning from it. And then verses 12 and 13, he's not talking about an individual. You know, you listen to this about strengthening your feeble arms and weak knees and make level paths for your feet. He's not talking about you as an individual. This is where that us language is so powerful. Because we are called to help the feeble arms among us, the weak knees among us, make level paths for the feet of the people among us, so that we will not be a church, a people who are called out that is disabled, but rather we will know what it means to be healed, like what verse 13 says. Going back to that occasion where Jacob wrestled with the Lord. Yes, physically speaking, he was altered from that day forward. And the rest of Israel was reminded of that time. But then there was also a healing that took place. There was a growth that took place. And those things can happen in our own lives too, if we choose to be trained by the discipline that comes our way. Because whenever we are disciplined, whenever we go through difficult times, realize that this is how we learn about righteousness, about peace, about holiness. If we choose to be trained by it, if we choose to learn the lesson that God is teaching us, there can be healing. And it might take some time, but when we stick with God, we can learn these things. We can experience that healing.
What shall I render to the Lord? Oh, what shall I render to the